In today's video, we're going to do a step-by-step guide on some preventative maintenance for your Westie. We're going to take the front wheel bearings apart, inspect the bearings and races, and pack them with fresh grease. There aren't any real special tools needed for this job, but there are a few parts you're going to need. First, you're going to need new wheel bearing seals. We got these from Go Westie. They're super cheap. Now, I've seen people reuse these. If you pry them out carefully, it's not worth it. These are a couple of bucks for brand new seals. You're going to need some wheel bearing grease. We use a Valvoline non-synthetic, just regular wheel bearing grease. I don't tend to use synthetic greases in the wheel bearings. For one, if we're in the middle of nowhere, we have a wheel bearing issue, we carry spare bearings and maybe some grease, but if you have to buy some grease locally at a parts store or a gas station, you may not be able to find a similar grease, and you don't want to mix greases in your wheel bearings. So a standard wheel bearing grease is going to be the same for just about through all manufacturers. One other thing we're going to do that's a little bit different is we're going to replace the standard nuts on the front of the spindles with these pieces from actually a Mercedes. Instead of having that little piece where you have to tamp down with a hammer and set the nut, these are more like the old Volkswagens, the air-cooled, where they have a bolt that's on that compresses the threads on there. This makes redoing your wheel bearings a lot easier, and to me this is a lot easier to set the tension on the bearing itself. So we'll be putting these in as well. The first thing we're going to want to do is get the vehicle on the jack stands. We don't want to work off just the jack. That's not safe, so put the jack stands in the appropriate places. So first, I'm going to show you how to check for your wheel bearing play before you get started. So if you grab the wheel at the 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock and give it a rock, you can hear a little bit of play. That's perfectly normal, and that's what you want. You do not want an overly tight, tapered roller bearing. What you're going to find is you're going to overheat them, and you'll be stuck on the side of the highway waiting for a tow truck. If you grab at 3 and 9, and move it, you probably won't get any play because the steering rack is holding the wheel from going back and forth. If you're getting play there, you may have a problem with your tie rod ends of your steering rack. Now you may find that your brakes look different than ours. We have the small car disc brake kit in the front, which puts an Audi caliper, a dual piston caliper on with a separate rotor. And you'll see as we take it apart, the rotor on ours is separate from the hub. On the stock Vanagons, the hub and rotor are all one piece. The disassembly is basically the same thing, except for ours, the hub is just separate. In order to remove the rotor, we have to take the caliper off first, and ours is going to come off in two pieces. We're going to take the caliper itself off first, then we're going to take the bracket off, because our bracket is, again, non-stock, and the bolts to take it off are kind of stuck back in there, and it's easier to do that with the caliper off. So the first thing we're going to do is take these two 13mm bolts off that support the caliper on the bracket. Kind of nut on the pins, slide pins will spin as well, so you gotta use a wrench to keep that from spinning. Once those are off, you should be able to take a screwdriver and pry the caliper off of the bracket, and the pads should stay in place. What you don't want to do is let this hang by the brake hose. So we kept the jack under the lower A-arm to kind of support the spring as well. And we're going to place ours right on there so it doesn't hang by the hose at all. You also take your pads out. It's a good time to inspect them. Again, ours may be a little bit different than yours because we have the small car kit. Next step is to remove these two bolts that hold the caliper bracket in place. And the whole bracket can come off. Also in the back is a spacer they give you to use this bracket with. Now that the brake caliper is off, we can slide our rotor off. Now again, if you have a stock Vanagon front brakes, you need to take the nut off that holds the wheel bearings on first, but since ours is, again, different, And we'll do that next by showing our rotor comes off separate. Next we have to take this dust cap off, and it's a press fit. You tap it with a hammer, so when you use a cold chisel and a hammer to kind of get behind the lip, spin it, give it a few taps. See it's starting to come. So the dust cap is off, and now you can see the nut that holds the bearing together. And this is what I was talking about earlier. This piece is you can see it with that, where it's been struck down to keep that nut from spinning. We're going to replace that with something different. So next step is to take this nut off. The front bearing will come out. We'll pull the hub off. And for you stock Vanagon brake people, this is the same thing you do. Take this off, take the front bearing out, and your whole hub and rotor will come out as one piece. So here is the thrust washer. Here's the outer bearing. There. At this point, you can take the hub off. Again, if you have a stock Vanagon, your hub and your rotor come off all at the same time. Then you have got your spindle left, and your rear bearing is in here behind that seal. Let's take a rag, wipe all that old grease off that spindle. Nice and clean. Now's the time you want to inspect it. It seems to be galling, overheating. Anything wrong with this? Because this, for one, these are hard to find on the newer model Vanagon still. You don't want to have any problems with your spindle at all. Take a rag and wipe that gunk off. You'll see the edges of the seal there. Take your pry tool. You could probably use a flat blade screwdriver, but these are pretty cheap and they work really well. See, we got that out without really damaging it. We could probably use this again, but why? They're cheap. Now this is out. We can pull our rear bearing out as well. And you want to take a rag and get all that old grease out of there. There'll be some on the race surface there, but there's a kind of a gap between the front and rear bearings. It's a kind of a grease reservoir, so you need to really get in there and get all the old grease out right there. So we'll go ahead and wipe all this out. We'll use some brake cleaner to clean all that out, make sure there's no gunk, no debris, no road grime in there before we put the fresh grease in. So now do the same with the bearings. All the old grease off. Start by with a dry, clean rag, so wiping all the grease off. Spin the bearing a bit and pushing that grease off the rollers. And once we have most of the grease off, we'll use some brake cleaner in a little container. We'll kind of spray and let them soak and get all that stuff out of there. And once they're all clean, we'll inspect the rollers and the races in the hub for any damages. Kind of rub these rollers around, trying to work all that grease out of there. See how it's kind of pushing up now. This kind of gives you your first indication as well as whether the bearing's bad. Do you hear any crunching or grinding, or is it sticking anywhere? These bearings so far feel wonderful for 50,000 miles. I believe these are FAGs, inside and out. Please buy quality bearings, don't buy cheap ones. Quality bearings are not that much more, and they will last much, much longer. So now that the bearings are clean, they're dry, we can kind of go through and inspect them and say, and these have maybe 50K on them, and they're FAGs. This one was made in Hungary, which don't know if that's where they're making these nowadays, but overall, sounds great. There's no grinding. All of the roller bearings look to be in really good shape. No scoring, no overheating. The overall cage is pretty tight. This bearing feels almost brand new, which is great. On the outer bearing, very, very similar. This is a SKF made in Japan, which I tend to prefer. The SKFs, had good luck with them on my KTMs over the years. But same thing, the bearings are good. No grinding. The rollers all look pretty good. So we're going to reuse both these bearings. Again, if you can keep up on your lubrication, change your grease out regularly, your seals, your bearings should last, by good quality ones, should last a very, very long time. There's no reason to change these bearings out just because we have it apart. On the hub, the races we're not taking out because we're not replacing the bearing, but these are all clean as well. These look brand new. There's not even any marks on them on either one. So again, high quality bearings, keep up on your grease changes, and you should have very good luck overall with your wheel bearings. So now we're going to grease the bearings. I tend to do it the old-fashioned way. I just put a glob of grease on my palm of my hand and I shove the grease through all those rollers. I've used some of the grease, I guess those kind of like grease buddy things, and they work okay, but they're such a mess. You use so much extra grease. And if you're greasing, wheel bearings every week, you're a mechanic or something, you can leave that grease in there and just push it through. Totally get why you do it. But for me, I might do this once every, 4 or 5 years. And so that grease just sits in that grease buddy, and I don't like it much. So we're just going to take a dollop of our Valvoline red grease. We're going to put it on the palm of our hand right here. Grab our inner bearing first, and we're trying to shove grease in all of those little rollers by just taking and pushing. You kind of see that it kind of gets in there. So we're going to keep just rotating and pushing till we have that whole outer filled with grease. So now we've got kind of grease on this side. We're going to turn it around now. We'll do the same thing here. We're going to kind of push grease in to those roller bearings in there. Keep going around. You really can't over grease the bearing because it's just going to take what it takes. It's going to push the rest out. So you don't want any air pockets or voids in there that can overheat that bearing as it first puts in. And then once you're kind of getting into this spot, put your fingers and kind of hold the inner and try to spin the outside to kind of get those bearings, again, lubed up really well. Push, use your thumb to push grease in every spot you can in there. Once you feel you've got it all nice, you'll notice the bearing is a lot tighter at this point. It's really hard to rotate because that stiff grease is stuck in all those roller surfaces, which is what you want. So now we have the inner bearing done. We'll repeat for the smaller outer bearing. Okay, so now we made a mess and got the outer bearing done as well. We'll put some grease on the inside of the hub and kind of that cavity, and then we'll insert the outer bearing. We'll insert the inner bearing and put the seal in, and we'll put the hub back on. So we kind of pack the inside of that reservoir with grease right now. So we'll take our outer bearing, and we'll just kind of drop it into that race. Just kind of push it. You see grease kind of oozing out. Kind of take your finger and push that grease back in those roller bearings the best you can. So we've got grease in the back of our seal. We cleaned the edge of the seal up a little bit. Push this in. Kind of hold it. Push one side in a little bit and hold your fingers on the other and just get a little gentle tap with the hammer around it. Want to kind of squirt around. What you don't want to do is get one side started too much. You risk bending the seal. And it just sits flush with the back of the hub. So we got our seal in, wipe a little more grease around. So we've got grease going all the way through. We're gonna need to clean that a little bit because it's just gonna get caught on the spindle as we put it on anyway. So we'll kind of clean that grease out, redisperse it inside, and we'll put the hub back on the spindle. So push straight on. It'll kind of be snug as that new seal works its way under the spindle. And you'll see lots of grease pushing out, which is good. Kind of give it a little spin. Kind of push it back. And you'll feel it kind of seat in there. There you go. Push the inner bearing, the outer bearing in. And we'll put on our washer and our new compression nut. So here we have our thrust washer we put on first. There's some grooves in the spindle. So one on the bottom, one on the top, and then one on the back side. This goes in the back side. And that's what presses against the inner race of the bearing. Take our new nut that's actually from Mercedes, and I'll link in the description where I got it from. It's got a flat side here that pushes against the thrust washer, and then the outer side. So this threads on, just like the original nut would, but instead of having to tamp in this thin kind of head on the nut to fit one of those grooves, this actually can just compress in, and we can tighten the threads down like the old air-cooled Volkswagens and keep that nut in place. Kind of do a hand tightening now. When we do that, we'll kind of rotate the bearing. You'll see more grease coming out. And what that's doing is kind of seating in the bearings, pushing out all the grease that's not needed, seeing that new seal against the back of the spindle. We'll take our crescent wrench and we'll rotate. We'll turn that nut down till almost the hub doesn't want to spin. And then we'll back it off. And we'll just rotate that hub a little bit all around and get the grease worked nice into the bearings. It should be fairly easy to spin at this point. Okay, so after we've tightened this nut while turning the hub to seat the bearings in, we back it off. And what the Bentley says to do is to have this thrust washer be able to move just slightly with finger pressure. So with a screwdriver, kind of watch this thrust washer here. We can get it on there. We just move it with the screwdriver, not a lot of pressure. So that means our bearings have the right amount of preload. That may seem too loose to some people, but that is what happens. The bearings will heat up a bit and expand as they go. So now we'll tighten this nut down to compress these threads on this nut, and that way we don't have to peen it. It will then just stay in place, and we can infinitely reuse this and adjust it as needed. Sounds smooth, no binding. Now we're ready to put it all back together. Our cap is all cleaned out with old grease. I'm going to push this back on too. We've got the caliper back on, the bolts are tightened up. One thing to note is since your caliper was off, the pads may not be bedded against the rotor all the way. So before you take off and drive, give that brake pedal a few pumps to set those pads back on the rotor. Well, this messy job is done. It's like CV joints. It's not a lot of fun to do. It's messy, but it's not all that difficult. Have some rubber gloves and plenty of rags laying around, and you'll get it done in no time. If you have any questions on what we did or comments, drop them down below, and we'll get those addressed. See you next time.